Hello and welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shepard-Nadze. Egypt is at a crossroads. Actually, it's been there for quite a while without finding the way to move on. After deposing dictator Mubarak, it seemed like the first green shoots of democracy appeared. But just after a year in office, Egypt's first ever democratically elected leader, Mohammed Morsi, was removed as well. Now the question is, what's next?
Mubarak ousted. Morsi ousted. Protests continuing. People dying. How much more blood has to spill to achieve stability? And how many more changes at the top? Are Egypt's leaders just puppets of the real pharaoh, the military? Will the sun ever rise over Egypt? Will the ancient land of Nile find peace and flourish again?
And our guest today is Nabil Fahmy, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt's interim government. Foreign Minister, it's great to have you in RT Studios today with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so it's not a dictatorship right now in Egypt. It's not quite a democracy. And people are talking about the military rule. Who is really in charge of the country?
I think it's very clear the people are. People changed the president twice in 2.5 years. After the second change in July 2013, we established an interim government, a civilian interim government that has a 9-month time frame with a specific mandate. Even though it's interim, it has a very historic responsibility. It has to establish the tenets of a democratic system. First, it put together a civilian government. Secondly, it started the constitutional process. We finished the legal reading of the Constitution. Now we're in the stakeholders reading, 50 members, different walks of life, trying to develop a constitution, and they have to finish within 2 months. Within 30 days after that finishes, we have a referendum for the public to say yes and no, and then we will hold 2 elections for parliament and for president. So it's really the people's choice. But this is an interim government. It's clearly that.
But how much of a weight does the army have right now in this government? I mean, people always talk about this is a military rule right now in Egypt. I know you're a civilian interim government, but do you actually rule yourselves, or do you obey to the military orders right now?
The only instructions, the only debates we have with the military and with the police, by the way, are part of the cabinet in our weekly cabinet meetings, and the police takes the lead, by the way. The police takes the lead in projecting the internal security situation, and the military will add to that in as far as it has strategic issues, especially on the Sinai, but also occasionally in the Delta as well. So frankly, I deal with the head of the military and the head of the police as colleagues in the cabinet, nothing more. But they have a special responsibility because of our security problems. We have a war against terror, or at least a problem with terrorists.
We're going to get to that in just a minute.
And that's really where the focus is on the security people.
But you've outlined a deadline for recent schedule for political transition. It should be about November, December, and that's when the Constitution will be finalized and approved. What will happen the next day the Constitution is actually approved?
After it's approved, within 30 days, we have to have a referendum for the public to say yes and no. And then
yes or no to the Constitution?
To the Constitution being proposed by the committee. As soon as that's finished, we then have to call for parliamentary elections, and after that, presidential elections. So we have to finish by spring of next year at the latest. By the end of spring of next year, we have to finish all of this.
Okay, as far as parliamentary elections, are the Muslim Brotherhood allowed, or are they banned from political life right now?
No, the Muslim Brotherhood there is a political party, Freedom and Justice Party, which emanated from the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is not a party, it's an association, a grouping. So their party is allowed to participate.
What if during the presidential elections a representative from their party or from the Muslim Brotherhood wins? Because they still have a lot of supporters in Egypt.
That's a great question, because many people say, well, what happens if it happens again? The problem with the last time, with President Morsi's election, wasn't that he was a good or bad president. Every country has good or bad presidents. There were 2 problems. One, we did not develop a constitution that reflected the people of Egypt. It was done basically by Islamists. So we didn't have checks and balances in our system, where if you elect a good president, he uses the checks and balances to the utmost. If you elect a bad president, the checks and balances control him. President Morsi without a good constitution, was trying to lead the country towards an Islamist face of Egypt. Islamists are part of Egypt, but they're not the complete face of Egypt. That was the problem. If we put together, and we will, put together a good constitution, it will not make a difference who you, let me be precise, it will make a difference who you elect, but it will not change the face of Egypt. If we put together a secularist candidate, a middle-of-the-road candidate, or even an Islamist candidate, he will be governed by the Constitution.
But will the Constitution will also be able to protect the presidency? Because like we've seen in the last 2 years, 2 presidents have been removed by protesters.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very good thing to do. And the reason it happened that way is the Constitution did not allow for repeal of the presidency or impeachment. We didn't have that in our system. So they had nowhere to go. People could not go to Parliament and say, the president is violating the Constitution, you need to remove him. We didn't have that system. We could not, for example, call for early elections. If you look at the European system, for example, the parliamentary unity systems, if the popularity of the prime minister is very, very weak, he can, and Parliament can, call for early elections. We didn't have that system. So the only recourse the public had was the street. The new Constitution should have a process of impeachment and recall and appeal. That process will, as you said correctly, protect the president from the street, but empower the street that they have a political channel to pursue their concerns if they are significant without having to go to the street.
But what would that Constitution do to Morsi's case? Because, you know, you can have different approaches to Morsi. Some people like him, some people despise him. But the fact is, he was democratically elected president and he was removed undemocratically. What would the new Constitution do for Morsi?
Morsi's case is over. Mm-hmm. There's no going back to Morsi's case. Morsi was elected through a democratic process. He did not, however, govern democratically. The essence of democracy is inclusiveness. You need to include all the people to feel that they are nationals of the country, even if they are in the minority. Minority nationals, be they Egyptian or Russian, does not mean they are not Egyptian or Russian any longer. So that was the problem with Morsi. It was not, frankly, that he was a good president or a bad president in terms of efficiency. If that was the case, we would have waited 3-4 years. The problem was he wanted to govern as only one political trend in Egypt and wanted to change the face of Egypt in that sense. So the point I'm making is the Constitution will ensure equal rights for the majority and the minority, irrespective of who is president. But nobody's going back. People, in the absence of, in the last Constitution, of a way for the public to speak out through the political system, they spoke out in the street. They did it twice, in huge numbers. Once you put together a proper constitution, the channels for political expression should be through Parliament, through the Shura Council, if we have one, through petition, through referendum, and so on and so forth.
Where is Morsi now? Why is there so much secrecy about his whereabouts?
First of all, he's now been charged with different legal charges. I don't want to get into the actual legal charges because the Attorney General investigates the different accusations, and then he formally only makes charges. Well, he may make several, but he will only make those where there's evidence to substantiate the charge.
I have to ask you, though, I'm sorry. I know there is a lot of speculation in the Egyptian media right now, and this, what I'm going to say, is a little bit more than just a gossip. He's officially charged with treason and conspiracy, but what the Egyptian media is saying, that he got money from the American administration to give Sinai away to Hamas. Are there any truths to this?
Look, as an official, but frankly, even as somebody in the public domain before being an official, I never comment on court cases before they are concluded. The reason being that the court has to judge whether the evidence is there or not. Anybody can make an accusation against anyone. Attorney General substantiates the evidence to see if there's enough evidence to take it seriously. If he does, it then goes to the court that determines innocence or guilt. We did that, by the way, with the accusations related to the former President Mubarak and his former officials as well. And in the first round of these accusations, most of the courts found them guilty. In the appeal process, some of the courts found some of the members innocent and others guilty. So our legal process, which takes time, is, I think, a separate legal process that's independent from the government, and it will take its decisions based on the evidence. So I'm not going to get into the actual accusations.
Okay, but not as a diplomat, as an Egyptian citizen, what do you think should happen to Morsi?
I think he should be given due process, which he is being given. He has access to his lawyers now, and all of the other members that are arrested have access to lawyers and family and so on. And at the end of the day, the courts will decide the verdict, not public opinion, emotions, or the Attorney General.
Foreign Minister, do you think you'll be getting any U.S. aid this year for your military and development needs?
The answer is yes, but frankly, I'm not focused on that. What I'm focused on is how to rebuild Egypt internally, and I think that's where our priority is. We will take our decisions regarding our internal situation based on our national interest, not on whether we get aid or not.
Thank you very much. After the break, how many people have to die before Egypt wins a hard-earned peace? And will Egypt stand aside if the U.S. ends up striking Syria? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show. Our guest is Nabil Fahmy, Egypt's foreign minister in the current interim government. Great to have you back, sir. So the release of Mubarak from prison soon after the arrest of Morsi, for many, it looks like the return of the old regime.
I think that's a false conclusion. It's actually evidence that our courts are independent. President Mubarak, former President Mubarak, was not released soon after Morsi was arrested. This happened 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Oh, he was released after Morsi was arrested.
It's a court process. The court process does not allow you to continue to hold people in incarceration beyond a certain point in time without a verdict being held against them. So I look at it. I mean, this is like looking at which side of the coin you want to look at. If you want to prove evidence of the court being independent, this is clear evidence of that, because the release of President Mubarak clearly complicates the politics in Egypt for the interim government. As you said, the perception is, are we now going back to before 2011? And that's a criticism and perception and a concern that is raised by some. The reality is, if we did not do that, if you tried to violate a court order, you'd actually be going against the tenets of a democracy, which is the rule of law. So is this a complicating factor? Yes. But do we have to respect the court system? That's what we have to do if you want to accept a democracy.
But just to make sure, Mubarak's trial will take place.
He has now a retrial, yes, of course. He's been released on another case, but in this case, yeah, sure.
But ever since General Sisi came to power, hundreds of people have died.
He didn't come to power.
Well, ever since, he's in charge, a lot of people have died.
He's still not in charge. He simply responded.
Well, he's responsible for the army, isn't he?
Yes.
Okay, so under his rule as a chief of the army, a lot of people have died, and a lot of them were also Muslim Brotherhood members. All I'm saying is that there is a rift in the country. It may be considerable, may not be considerable, but there is a rift, and people are dying and have been dying. How do you guys plan to reconcile?
Well, several ways. First of all, the message has to be clear for everyone. Violence, terrorism, criminal acts will not be condoned.
But violence goes both ways, though, no?
I know. I didn't say which side. I mean, I'm just saying violence will not be condoned by anybody, anywhere, irrespective of the justification. You cannot have a democracy that's not based on the rule of law and security. That's the first point. Secondly, anyone, any political party, irrespective of if it's left-leaning, right-leaning, or whatever, if it is consistent with the Constitution and non-violent, it has a place in Egyptian politics. Those are the end games. The beginning is you have to have security. The end game, you have to have inclusiveness for everyone. The real challenge, which you're questioning, is what do you do in the middle? How do you get there? we're trying to get there by including everybody in the debate on the Constitution. The Islamists have membership in that commission. Muslim Brotherhood has not come in, but the Noor Party, the Salafis, have agreed to come in. Secondly, we have a reconciliation commission where we're trying to bring in everyone, including the Muslim Brotherhood, to dialogue about, okay, what are your concerns? You feel there's excessive pursuit of your leaders? Well, show us who are the civilians who are being not using force and who are. You want assurances that you will have rights in Parliament? Well, let's talk about these things. Now, they haven't yet agreed to participate. The Salafis did, but the Muslim Brotherhood did not. It's a process where you build confidence by your actions, not only by what you say. So I think that the real generating force of this confidence will be the Constitutional Commission as we develop the provisions of the new Constitution, indicating that it's inclusive. You will see more leaders participating in it. And hopefully we'll have all of them there as long as they announce openly that they will not pursue their goals through the use of violence.
You know, there's a lot of talk about the reestablishment of the State Security Service that under Mubarak was actually responsible for horrible human rights violations, to say the least. I mean, I know you're in transitional period, but how do you make sure that, you know, terror doesn't come back and people aren't scared and their rights aren't violated once again? Because this organization that everyone was like, is back now.
Well, it's a great question, but let me just answer it a bit more carefully. No security system in the world bases itself only on force, and the really successful ones base themselves on information, on data, so that you don't have to use force. You preempt the problem by understanding what the issues are. So all these institutions internationally have their intelligence arm. The problem in the past wasn't that you have an intelligence arm or not. It was the practices that they pursued. In other words, how they got the information and what they did with the information. Our challenge is to have an organization that can gather the information, but respects the rules of law, respects international norms, operates within a democratic context. So I'm not that concerned with the principle of establishing an intelligence branch in the Ministry of Interior. That seems logical. But you're right. This has to be done in a new way, so it doesn't haunt us with the practices of the past.
Because too little time has passed
of course.
For that organization to drastically change and become
again,
modern.
I mean, you've raised a number of really great questions. Why do you arrest 2,000 people rather than 100 people? Because you're not sure who did what.
Exactly.
So the best way to know is to have the information, to gather the information a priori, so that you don't have to go out and arrest them first and then investigate.
So are you going to release them?
Of course you will. As you interrogate them, some will be released immediately and some have. Others, where the evidence is a bit more substantial, they will be considered by the Attorney General. Even he will decide, well, it's not substantial enough and will release some more. And then he cannot claim guilt or innocence. He has to then give it to the court system. So I support having an intelligence branch, but I completely agree with you. That branch has to act in a different fashion than it did in the past, and it should get human rights training, and I completely support that.
Since you're saying information is key and it's important, do you have a number of how many people exactly have been arrested in the last period of time?
I don't. Frankly, first of all, I don't. Secondly, a lot have been arrested and released. So my answer is no, I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay, now to the foreign politics. What position will Egypt pursue towards Hamas-led Gaza? Because things have changed.
Well, again, it seems that in everything we're doing these days, we're balancing two different things. On the one hand, let me be very clear about this. We do not support a policy of a sustained blockade on Gaza because it ends up with Palestinian suffering. The average Palestinian in Gaza suffers from the blockades and the shortages and so on and so forth. So morally and politically, we cannot sustain that position. At the same time, we cannot allow, especially with our security situation today, for extra-legal systems. In other words, networks that work outside of the legal system, including, was one example, the tunnels. Once you do that, you develop relationships that go beyond the traditional authority, and it ends up leading into organized crime and so on and so forth, irrespective of whether Hamas is part of that or not. Thirdly, let me be very, very clear here. We will not accept any interference in our internal affairs by anybody, including Hamas, if and when that's the case and is proven. And they should be very, very clear about that. So we're balancing all three of these. We will close the tunnels. Our relations with Hamas will be completely above board and transparent. We will deal with them on that basis. And thirdly, we are looking at a new system with Abu Mazen and with the President Abu Mazen and with Hamas to manage the entry points into Gaza to ensure that goods and services are made available.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any concerns whatsoever that Egypt could find itself in a similar situation that Syria? Because Muslim Brotherhood members have vowed to fight till the end.
No, I don't see the situation being the same. While, of course, there are members of certain organizations, including the Muslim, some members, who seem adamant about making this an existential battle. There are others, frankly, who are talking about that it's time to move on, it's time to be part of the future. So I don't see that. And secondly, frankly, the proportion and the numbers in Egypt are significantly different from what you see in Syria. We have a challenge. Egyptian people have to come together, have to accept that we may differ with each other, we may argue with each other, but we will do that peacefully. Mm-hmm. But I don't see it as a Syrian situation.
Kerry said, and that was after Kerry-Lavrov accord, that the strike may still take place if Syria doesn't comply. What will your position be in that case if strike does take place, because it's still a possibility?
First, let me say, I congratulate Russia and applaud its initiative to try to find a political resolution for this. Secondly, I set forth at the Arab League what our position was. One, I condemned the Syrian regime for its practices against its people. Secondly, I condemned the use of chemical weapons by anyone against anyone and wanted whoever did that to be held accountable. Thirdly, I said openly, I don't support the use of force against Syria, that the use of force, when used on an exceptional basis, had to be done in accordance with the UN Charter and the UN rules. So,
you left out the opposition. What do you think of opposition?
That's why I said use of chemical weapons by anyone against anyone. I did not leave out the opposition. And in my speech, I also said I was against the militarization of the conflict, which included the opposition, by the way. I'm just talking about the chemical weapons. But my point here is, in the past, in the liberation of Kuwait, we supported the use of force in liberating Kuwait, in getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We actually participated militarily because that was done within the UN. So there will be cases where the use of force is justified. If it is justified by the UN, we will then accept it as a norm, even if we don't like it as a political decision. But we can't accept that just because we and you happen to agree today, we have the right to use force. What happens if two others agree in the future? How do I ensure my security?
Just lastly, do you think it's normal, it's okay that Syria's fate is being decided between America and Russia and not the Arab world?
And another great question. It really is a great question. There are more people fighting in and around Syria about things nothing to do with Syria than there are Syrians fighting. This is a conflict, a geopolitical conflict, where not only the big powers, the big international powers and the big regional powers are all competing with each other there. In the middle of all that, you have the Syrian powers either fighting each other or being used by. So it's a very complicated problem. Because it's so complicated and because it's extra-regional, that's what makes the Arab League position difficult. The Arab League did try to solve this initially. It did not succeed because there are so many extra-regional powers, which led the Syrian powers to leverage their politics internationally rather than regionally. And therefore, the Arab League, when it failed in doing this, asked the Security Council to take charge.
Thank you so much for this great interview. That's it for today. We were speaking to Nabil Fahmy, Foreign Minister of Egypt. Thanks for watching us, and we will see you here at Sophie & Co. next time.